Hello, Ian. Hi, Simon. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
I am very excited to have you here today and to talk about L&D, the future of L&D, learning and development, and immersive experiences. And as we just touched upon in our pre-conversation, collaboration and co-facilitation between two potentially very different experts. And let me start with my general question to get the ball rolling. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you? Ian, do you want to start?
Yes, I'd love to. Do I call myself? There's a seminal moment in my career that happened. I was actually working as a facilitator in inverted commas, probably for about 10 years or 11 years, and being really quite successful. I think there was something about coming in with a beginner's mindset that really is probably worth unpicking later on, because my career almost went through a U when the ego developed and kind of I started to think I was better than I was. But I was having lots of success for the first 8 to 10 years. But after about 8 or 9 years, I think, of really working and doing a lot of leadership development programs, what started to happen what had happened previously up until this point was whenever participants were leaving the room, I'd be standing by the door and they would all be waiting in line one by one to shake my hand and say, "Hey, Ian, you did a great job in there. You were so impressive." And unbeknown to me, my little ego was ticking away, right? And then after about 8, 9 years of doing this work, what started to happen was they would ignore me when they went to the door, and they'd spend all their time shaking hands with each other. And
Beautiful.
at that point, someone turned around to me and said, "You know what? You've just become a facilitator." And I think for me, that was the beginning of a real journey to understand that facilitation is about working with emergence, not sort of mechanistic change. And it's about creating the conditions for others to do. And that's really taken me on a lifelong journey ever since that day.
Mm. Thank you so much for sharing this anecdote. I love it so much. We'll come back to that later.
Thank you.
Shall I go?
Simon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, I don't really identify as a facilitator. I definitely aid in facilitation with Ian on some of the experiences we do, but I think I primarily identify as an immersive experience and game designer. And with a particular, so some of it's work that's purely for what I can call leisure and doesn't really have a high aspiration than team building, which is nothing wrong with that. And then on the other side, what's my true passion is really working on games and immersive experiences that were specifically designed for learning and development and facilitators. And yeah, I don't really like doing things that people have done before. So when Ian and I got together with Rob as well, then that's I think what was a lot of the excitement is like, ooh, this might really work, and not really people haven't tried it yet. So yeah,
Mm.
that was a lot of the fascination. So that's a bit about me.
Great. And I would love to hear later maybe how then you work together as the experience designer. So someone who is specialized in the design and then someone specialized in the facilitation in the room. And before getting there, I cannot not jump on what you just shared of you you enjoy doing things that haven't been done before. So something we share.
Yes.
And speaking about learning and development, what is there that hasn't been done before? And what what is going wrong, or what are we getting wrong about the L&D space that I hear very often is just same old and maybe falling flat, not engaging the
Yeah.
learners?
Yeah. And maybe I'll take this one, I think.
Mm.
So I think the context to be able to answer that question is, first we have to look at the context that we're living in. And I think it's been done to death. So if there are other facilitators here and I bring out the old VUCA word, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, I think that word's been done to death and people are tired of hearing it. But the truth is, we're living through a change in society that is probably the biggest disruption to modern society that we've lived in the last 200 years, without a shadow of a doubt. And the rules of the business are changing, and with it, the rules of leadership. But what I observe is in this new world, and this is part of what one of our strap lines is: the future is here and now. Typically, the way we've seen leadership development and development working is a real emphasis on codified learning, classroom learning, and theoretical learning. But the fact of the matter is that in a volatile world that is complex, disruptive, and emergent, theoretical and codified learning only takes you so far. What really we need to be emphasizing much more is here and now learning about ourselves, about what's happening in the groups and the dynamics that we're part of, and actually really here and now learning about what's going on in the organization. And I think that for most companies that are set up in a mechanistic model, it's very hard to get to grips with that idea.
Mm. And the disruption and the volatility, as you said, we've heard that for so long and so many times. Is it now a new disruption with AI coming in that basically there is no, or all the potential answers are on our fingertips anyway? So the only thing that there is to learn and to adjust to is the human dynamics.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that I mean, AI is such a huge focus at the moment in the OD space that I'm dealing with and with my HR clients. And of course, it has huge benefits. But I think for me, the belief I have around this environment we're living in is that just to take a step back for a minute, often when I talk to clients, and I believe this is, I say to me, how many organizations do you have? And they say, well, one, of course. But actually, the fact is we have two organizations that are every organization is a construct of two organizations that are interconnected, but really, really separate. And one of them is the formal organization, which is where we spend most of our time. It's the structure, it's the processes, it's the strategies, it's everything about the business that can be written down on paper. Mm-hmm. But underneath that, and a much more powerful part of the organization is what we call the informal organization. It's culture, it's the network of relationships, it's the patterns of behavior, the mindsets that we hold. And the fact of the matter is that in a volatile environment, disruptive change means you have to change the informal system as well as the formal. And the problem is AI can give you data on what's happening in the informal system, but it doesn't understand how to work with complex emergent systems. So what it's going to do is give you a lot of great focus on what you need to do on the formal side. So it's going to tell you, how should I change my processes? What can I do with my structures? You can say what's going on in the informal system. But then when you think about, well, how do I change my culture? How do I change that leader's behavior? Or how do I even get that team to work together, or those two teams to work together? That is where AI reaches its limits. And that is where I think we need a greater emphasis actually on human intuition, human awareness, and here and now learning back within our businesses to complement and to sit alongside AI.
Thank you. This makes a lot of sense. Although I must say for a split second, I thought, isn't there then also a third part of the organization? So there's the informal and the formal part, but then within the formal part, there's also the content part and the support part. And these very often are two very separate entities that already struggle to speak the same language. One speaks the business language, the other one speaks the administrative language.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Yes. So you're right. I wouldn't put that as different. So I would say that within the formal organization, you have a structure which puts people into those different roles. And then what you see is mapped to that in the informal organization, those two different functions create their own tribes with their own set of norms, their own set of beliefs in the informal surface. The informal system, that very rarely gets surfaced. So rather than saying, hey, you work in HR and I work in business, we've got some different assumptions at play. Let's slow down for a minute and let's really figure out not how to solve this problem, but why we keep bumping up against each other. So let's go into the informal system. Most organizations will stay on the formal system, say, it's not working. I need you to do this. I'm going to push harder. And I'm just going to focus on action rather than slowing down into inquiry, which is really the secret of working with the informal system.
Yeah. And for this, we need self-awareness, the openness, the open mind, the realization that there actually is a problem and that we cannot change other people by telling them that they have to do things differently.
Exactly.
And I saw Simon nodding and smiling. So I assume that this is where you and your work comes in. So how do we solve that then? What's your solution?
Well, I mean, AI is, a really interesting thing. I mean, it's my background is I studied computer science like some 32 years ago, which was, it was already coming into sort of like the courses back then. It's something I've got some level of interest in, and particularly over the last few years where we've really seen things start to explode and become a lot more public. And I definitely think it's going to have a positive impact on both learning and facilitation, but we're still a long way from AI being, I think, from being able to sort of like literally almost be like a camera in the room in a group and be able to tell exactly what's going on in the room, to pick up on all that body language, to pick up on all those little nuances, little flickers in people's eyes, and sort of go, what is that actually meaning? And sort of like, how is someone who's talking being received in the room? And then to be able to actually, give them proper feedback afterwards. It's, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think we're sort of some way off from that yet. And to Ian's point, yeah, it's having we're not able to replace humans, I think, yet as good facilitators.
Yeah, especially I think the nuances that you mention and the body language is so dependent also on cultural patterns. So
Right.
depending on which cultural context we're in, people might have different body language meaning different things. And then when we then entered the space of neurodiversity, having different body language or different verbal language might again mean very different things.
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned, as Ian touched on before, I've sort of self-identified relatively recently as being more on the ASD spectrum than some people. And having spoken and worked with other sort of people who are more autistic, or have ADHD or something like that, sometimes that, they'll particularly just, it could be a small thing like they'll be, to help them concentrate, they'll need something in their hands to fiddle with, whether it's a pen or something like that. And if you don't know that, and that's actually helping them concentrate. Whereas to someone else who doesn't know that, they might be like, I'm boring you. You're fiddling with something because I'm bored. It's not actually helping you concentrate. So you're right. Whether it's through cultural things. I mean, I've worked in different countries around the world as well, Middle East and stuff. And there can be enormous cultural differences in how people accept and take them, from even just greeting each other to let alone to how do we resolve conflict or something like that. Go on, Ian.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm going to just put a bit of challenge into the ointment here, because it's very interesting how we're talking about the use of AI, which is to know stuff, right? Oh, I can know that the group is disengaged. I can know that person's disengaged, but I'm just going to take it back to the example I was making before. It's really interesting because we've been so driven into this mechanistic formal system mindset that we think, well, as long as I as the leader know what's going on in that group, that's what I need to know, right? What action do I need to take? But that's not the way that culture and relationships work. If the three of us were in a group together and Simon suddenly found out that, I don't know, Miriam's looking disengaged, that piece of information on its own doesn't do anything. The thing that transforms the group is the conversation, right? When Miriam says to you, Simon, I'm feeling disengaged, and you say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And then you say, how do I do that? And it's the relational contact between those two that's really important. And I think very often what we are not emphasizing it, that businesses are fundamentally networks of human relationships, and it's the relational aspect that often drives the change in the systems and processes. So AI can tell you stuff, it can tell you what's going on, but it won't change those relationships. The only way to change relationship is through dialogue. And ultimately, one of the phrases we overuse a lot, though, is if you really want to change the organization, you first need to change the conversation. And it's an old one, but we still think it's true.
What I hear is the learning and development space or leadership development space has focused on basically communicating change through the organization and trying to make other people understand and maybe follow, or even squeeze content into their minds. And nowadays, what is actually really needed is to open up conversations, to share perspectives so that people can align through their own efforts and curiosity.
Exactly right. And if you just take that example a bit further, leaders at the top of organizations tend to exactly as you said, focus on telling people what they need to do, making sure they're clear on it, and making sure they go and do it. But then what's missing in that is that those people at the bottom of the organization, when you go and speak to them without their bosses there, will say, look, we're ready to implement the strategy, but do our bosses know that they micromanage us, or that they are consistently misaligned with each other as a team, or that they bully us, or that there are often behaviors within the relationships that inhibit the system to be able to deliver what people need, but there's no conversation around that. There's no feedback mechanisms, particularly upper business or across functions, is where that relational and dialogic contact is lost, and there's no emphasis on it at all.
And then does it become a vicious circle or a lost game that once the organization or the culture turned toxic, that there's actually no conversation possible? Or can you then gamify them back into a healthy conversation, healthy culture?
Well, it's interesting, because I'll hand to Simon in a minute just to talk about the work we've done and team development and what we found about teams. But I think the one thing that I would really emphasize about what you said is, very often when I go into an organization, it is to unpick these toxic situations. And what I generally find is that where you don't have a culture of radical candor, where people are actually saying what they think to each other and confront, we have a rule in our business that if I say something to Simon about our third partner, Rob, he is then responsible for making sure that I close the loop with Rob. Because that kind of conversation where I don't speak to the person involved, but I speak to a few of my friends, spreads toxicity through the organization. So even if Simon's never met Rob, first time he meets him, he's going to go, "Oh, you're a bit like that, are you?" And then over time, what happens is these conflicts normally happen across functions. So we have different objectives. We often have different personality types. But what happens over time is those positions become embedded and they become truths. And then you have to work a lot harder to unpick them. So it's not as if, oh, Miriam's like that. It's like, oh, God, marketing are like that. And they're so useless. And what becomes allowable within other functions is to badmouth those people as truth. So, and then they become almost held as truth, and they become a lot harder to unpick. And I guess that's where we've been doing a lot of our work with teams on the immersive side. So Simon, I don't know if you wanted to say a bit about kind of what we found about the work we do and how that really helps to unpick these stuck situations.
Before Simon, you answer, I just want to make sure that sometimes when we listen to a podcast, we miss certain things because our brain wanders. And I think what you just shared about when you speak about the third person to Simon, then it's Simon's responsibility to report that. And I think it's beautiful if this becomes the norm. And if you have this radical transparency that this will happen, it basically formalizes the talking behind someone's back.
Exactly.
And reporting, and it's beautiful. So yeah, just to have this context and the spirit in mind when we now listen to Simon. Thank you.
To pick up on some of what I think Ian was alluding to is that one of the things we've done in our what we call immersive development experiences, or IDEs, that's our kind of little acronym for what these things are. And one of the things we've done is, rather than necessarily just take one team and put them through a series of games, challenges, experiences across 1 or 2 days maybe, is to actually put multiple, or at least more than one team doing the same thing in parallel. So we kind of, and often in the same space, it might be in a sort of conference room or something like that. So on one side of the hall, we've got, team A, and the other side, we've got team B. And sometimes we deliberately give them different colors. And we often have a score running through the experiences, and we say, like, that's the objective of the day is to score as many points as possible. And we've even got scores up in the A team in their red color and the B team in their blue color. But at no point have we ever said you need to score more than the other team. And so they naturally fall into exactly. So they naturally fall into this trap. So they might be doing something that we have run that's a bit like an escape room type game, with lots of it's a complex challenge, emergent things happening, needing to pivot and shift strategy. And, they're doing it side by side, like in one half of the room each, and, just getting on with that. And almost like never does someone go, well, let's just go and ask the other team how to solve this. And there's nothing stopping them. And in fact, going back to specifically what made me think of that, what Ian was saying, is one of the times I remember we did something in Germany a year or so ago, one of the teams actually did think of that. They were stuck on a particular puzzle and they were like, right, I'm going to go over and talk to the other team. And I watched what happened. And when that person went over to the other team, what happened was the other team were right in the middle of a discussion about something. So the person came over sort of really, gingerly and sort of went like, oh, can I ask something? And they were like, oh, not right now. That person went back to the other team, their team, and they said, oh, how did you get on? And he said, excuse my language here, but they told me to fuck off. That's what they literally said. And of course, I witnessed it. They hadn't said that. But now, of course, his whole team have gone, oh, that other team hate us. They told you to fuck off and stuff like that. And now come back over. And that's exactly what Ian's talking about, just emerged in an instant. And it wasn't even based on reality. They just asked for a moment, like to sort of, because they were in the middle of something. And then you see that, snowball through the day sometimes with more and more mistrust building up. And then at the end, we kind of go, well, sort of like, and sort of team A have got more points than team B, and they're all celebrating and going, yay, we won. And it's like, did you? Yeah. And then there's that penny drop moment. And then, of course, it's the realization why we do this, because we really try to bake into these like immersive learning experiences real world business problems like silo thinking, exactly what Ian's talking about, like, oh, the marketing team, they think this, or they're always tight with their money, or they don't trust us and stuff like that. And people forgetting we're all just part of one organization and company. And it's fascinating seeing people fall into this, playing these games, letting themselves go and getting into it, and at the end going like, is this all a metaphor for our lives and our work? And we're like, maybe. Let's unpack that in the facilitation afterwards.
And yeah, thanks, Simon. And that's a beautiful illustration of, I think, the power of those kind of immersive experiences is, before we come in and do the immersive experience, we'll often ask the groups to unpack about the culture in their organizations they work. And they'll be really good at pointing fingers about leaders, other teams. But the problems with the culture are always externalized to every person. It's not me, it's out there, it's out there, it's out there. And there's often not enough of a willingness to reflect personally on how do I co-create the culture. So then we take people through this experience where we don't tell them to compete. They could collaborate, but they don't, because that's human nature. Two teams, they choose to collaborate. We put little kind of Easter eggs all the way through where there's an opportunity for them to either collaborate and take half the money each, or they can try to compete and win it. And prisoner's dilemma and all stuff, and they screw each other a number of times. So by the time they get to the end of the day where they actually need to collaborate on something, within a day, these relationships have been damaged. And then when we make the point, and then when they make the links to their organizations, there's an opening in people. There's an opening where for the first time, they're like, oh shit, we've done that here. We've just recreated the culture here. We've been blaming everyone else, saying it's not about us. It's in us. And what we find then is the capacity for really transformational dialogue opens up in that space. And that's where you can really do the work with people who are in the space where transformation can happen.
I love that. And thank you for the example. And I can totally see this aha moment. And I was designing a session on how to have difficult conversations at work, and discussed with a colleague, and then came to the realization that actually the most important point is to arrive at the acknowledgement that both parties have responsibility in the situation. And I think it's the same thing in our private life. We clash and have fights with our loved ones until both acknowledge, sorry.
Yeah.
Also
I
did
played
something
a part
wrong.
in it too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not all you.
Yeah. And then to recreate that, the opportunity for this reflection, so that people point it with the fingers on themselves.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And still, I wonder what happens then. So I can see the transformation and the big aha in the moment, and then the debrief. And I can imagine that even, especially when there are two different teams doing that, that it's even stronger. And what happens on Monday?
It's a really good point. So we talk a lot about the immersive experiences run as a kind of 1 or 2 day event, but all of the work we do is around leadership journeys or programs. And that might be, and we'll often use an immersive development event to kick off an action learning program. So a virtual action learning program where people might be in groups of 4 to if it wasn't a real team, I'll come back to a real team in a moment. But if it was an action learning group, we'd have 8 people go through 2 groups of 4, and then they would carry on learning and meeting virtually afterwards. And we find
What is an action learning group?
So action learning is a process. So we use it in all of our development, and it's the antithesis to, like, if you like, theoretical or codified learning. So codified learning is, I'm your facilitator. I'm going to stand at the front, give you a model, tell you how great, here's the great model, go and apply it. But I'm the expert. Action learning is a peer coaching process where if the 3 of us were to form an action learning group, once a week, you might bring an issue and Simon would coach you, and I would then provide feedback to Simon on his coaching, and we'd rotate.
Okay, great.
And they're really instrumental for turning theoretical learning, crossing what we call the learning doing gap. So many people have this knowledge in their heads, they don't translate into behavior. Action learning is our preferred framework for doing that.
And air quotes, forcing everyone into the humility of sharing a challenge and then communicating or supporting each other as a team instead of competitors.
Yeah,
absolutely right. And and I will come back to the point about real teams in a minute, but just on this is, and the reason we think that's so fundamental is obviously self-awareness is one of the key skills for transformational leadership. But then the second one is the ability to, the capacity for inquiry, for deep inquiry, and to ask really powerful questions. Most leaders are out of practice at that. So we're building these fundamental skills, both in training programs, be it action learning and theoretical learning, or with real teams. So not forgetting that point and how we do it. The immersive development experiences that we create are normally the first day of a 3-day or a 4-day transformation conference. So, which is where the real work will happen. So I'm just flying out to Singapore to go and do an event for a client next week, where the main part is a 3-day business conference, participative working on initiative 1, initiative 2, and checking in on that. But what we've found is that the success of those programs, those conferences, those 3-year conferences, is transformed by 10x when you do something immersive up front. Before we start working on the business, let's connect outside of that as people. Let's establish a culture of feedback, and let's foster some tighter connection amongst the people in this group. And then, of course, you move more into the traditional stuff, and so that's more about how it gets back into the Monday, if you like.
And then basically you're creating a support structure for the leaders who went through the training so that on Monday they can actually apply or try to apply what they learned and have their support group to discuss whenever it failed, or to keep them accountable to actually do that.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
If I can just add to that, I mean, to me, it's like having, as well as designed, watch these experiences. It's such an important part of this is making people feel like they're in a psychologically safe space. I spent the first part of my main career on the other side. You know, I was in corporates watching all these problems emerge. So I've been at the sharp end of it on the other side quite a lot. And people just don't. I've worked at a lot of different companies over a long time. People just, it was so rare to just have like authentic, open conversations about what's actually really going on in the relationships, the work, yeah, not that. So creating what is a psychologically safe space for people in these experiences where we kind of deliberately set them up to sort of be provocative, stressful, challenging. You know, it's not supposed to be easy, that people's reactive tendencies start to emerge. And we're like, that's fine. And we get them into their groups afterwards, giving, you know, not us telling them so much about what's going on, but them giving them, learning this sort of circle of like giving them feedback on them, giving feedback on each other, taking a turn in, you know, the hot seat, right? What did you think of me as a leader in that last experience, Miriam, Ian, and stuff like that? What would you recommend I do differently next time? And then when it's your turn in the next experience, Miriam, get really used to that being a safe and essential thing for us to really learn about ourselves.
When I hear you speaking about the immersive experiences, I keep on wondering, what does it actually mean, immersive experience? Because I can think of a live action role play where everyone wears their and I can think of a virtual experience, or I can think of so where does it start and where does it end? Because I can also imagine that immersive experiences is kind of used as a buzzword. Yes. And as soon as we invite people into a different conference center and arrange the chairs differently, it's an immersive experience.
Yeah. Well, perhaps if I lead on that one. So yeah, you're absolutely right about immersive being an overused buzzword. I mean, you know, going in a swimming pool is an immersive experience, right? But that's not what we talk about, you know, sort of like in our context here. So it could be all sorts of things. A lot of it's about games. and things where people, we put people into a very much a play environment, because we know that people learn more like animals in a play environment. So, and that's absolutely fine. But it could be a game, it could be a virtual reality game, it could be all sorts of different types of games or challenges. We've really tried to bring in a lot of things from other industries that have been there for a while, that just, frankly, learning and development's generally boring. Most of it's still classroom and theoretical, as Ian was saying. It's like very rarely fun, real fun. And we've taken things from other industries, like, from technology, video games, virtual realities, escape rooms, immersive theatre, and which are all sort of booming sort of things, and gone, what happens if we bring those things in intentionally and design something in learning and development that is still fun, but it's not fun first? In the leisure market, all of these things, it's fun is the most important thing, and it's right. If I go to an escape room, it should be fun. If I do a video game, it should be fun. And fun's enormously important, but it's not the most important thing in what we design. And I think that, if I sum up what to me, why do we make something immersive? It's trying to give people as much of a sort of, where they forget they're taking part in an activity or something that's structured learning or a game, and they start to behave authentically as they would in their real life, in their working life, not how they think the facilitators, their colleagues, want them to behave or what they're expected to say, as in they're really showing up as their true selves. Because once we do that, then it really helps like unpack, sort of there.
Yeah. And if I just say on that very quickly, I mean, what Simon's talking about there is absolutely how this partnership was founded, really. And it's really because the values that we often espouse are not the values that we rely on in practice. There's often such a disconnect. One of the biggest failures in leadership is people having a different self-image or set of beliefs they think they hold, and then acting on a different set when they're actually out in the world. And this was brought home to me before I even met Simon. I was running years and years ago a conference on dealing with crisis and crisis management and leadership in a crisis. And we'd given all the theoretical frameworks, and I'd asked people, how do you see yourself in a crisis? And there was this one guy there who was like, oh, I'm very good in a crisis, very macho voice, very male, presented as very masculine, very tough. I'm very good in a crisis, very crisis. And this one time, a mouse appeared in the conference room and ran out, and he shrieked out of everybody in the audience and jumped on the chair, literally just straight afterwards. And it was such a message to me where I thought, what am I doing here? Why am I spending my time just listening to people's self-assessment that might be really, really wrong? Is there not a way of putting people into situations where their true uninhibited self shows up, so they can really see how they are, not how they think they are?
Yeah. I love that. And it reminds me of continuously serving people, asking them for the most mundane skills like driving. How would you assess your driving compared to others? And everyone is above average, according to their own assessment. So yes, we are particularly bad in assessing ourselves. And in your example, or these examples bring up several questions, curiosities. One is, how long does it take for someone to really take on this role? Is it enough to assign someone to team A, team B, and suddenly something happens in our brain and we are playing this role already? And then, so that's one question. And a follow-up question that I can also park is, how do you create then the safety that Simon also mentioned before, where the macho guy jumping on a table can then, because there are two things that can happen. Him, when someone starts laughing, him becoming defensive and shouting and angry, and finding any way to explain his behavior and why it perfectly suits his self-image, cognitive dissonance, or him starting to laugh and like, maybe I should review how good I am in a crisis.
Do you want to start, Ian?
Yeah, I will do. So I think, just remind that the first question, if you just remind me, the first one was, how long does it take? And I think, and the second answer is going to actually build on this as well. But the thing I would say is, it starts from the moment you arrive. And then I think there are things that you can do to create, as Simon said, if you've got two teams, one of the best way to create team identity is to give them different colored uniforms to wear, get them to create a name for their team, get them to do the introductions in their teams, and that's already starting to bond these teams. But then exactly, and you're creating these tribes. And then what we find is that then when the pressure starts to build, so you start to put them into something that's a bit frenetic, where they've got loads to do, it's a bit chaotic, and they're worried, they immediately start to worry about how their team's doing versus another team. And so then that competition and that unity just starts to build through that crisis. And it is, I mean, if you go back to the founding father of group dynamics was a guy called Wilfred Bion, and he described 3 different processes by which groups create their identity, one of which is this fight-flight reflex. You know, the way that we create the identity in our team is by having enemies outside, and it's so easy to trigger that. So
deeply
easy.
Ingrained, yeah.
Exactly. But I do think the second point, and then Simon, I'll hand over to you, but the second point about how do we create the safety, and this goes back to it being a journey. So before we even put people through the immersive day or days, we will, if we're dealing with a team of 8, let's say, for example, we'll meet with, we'll form that team of 8 into 2 little action learning groups of 4 people. And those teams of 4 will meet before they arrive at the event. And that event will be constructed so that they can get to know each other. They can build some familiarity. They can start to practice feedback skills, because that's going to be so critical, but they also can contract a bit around their norms and how they work. And we find that those groups, having formed and developed before the event, creates a support network. And it's a small enough group that you can create that support network within the event as well. Having said that, there are still times where people get, feedback that makes them angry, and or it makes them really pissed off, or it makes them reject the training. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, throughout all the clients have said, well, how are we going to measure impact of what we do? Let's look at happy sheets. And I want 100% top marks 5 out of 5. And I've always said, well, I want 10% 1 out of 5s, because sometimes people are going to reject. And I think there's a balance to be struck between creating enough safety so everyone feels safe, but also being willing to accept that sometimes people are going to push back because they're going through an internal process themselves.
You basically attacking their identity and self-view. That's what you're doing. And that's what you want to do. And that's painful. And the first reaction, very human reaction, is to dismiss you. Of course you're wrong.
Exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, if I go back to, like, I'll say a couple of things. One, it was something happened to me when I did my first corporate job. I think I was 21. So we're talking 1992 here. And I remember it like it was yesterday. So we were put into 2 teams in 2 different rooms. This is a part of an off-site sort of getting to know each other graduate program thing. We were given a single challenge. We were 2 teams put into 2 rooms, and we were told, here's a collective problem you've got to solve, but you can't go between the 2 rooms. And there's a telephone in each room, and you can talk to the other people. And of course, they've got some information that you need, and vice versa. And at the end of the experience, when the facilitator, you know, was sort of getting us everyone back together and asking how it went, they went straight in for me. They said, Simon, can you remember the bit where, you know, you picked up the phone? And I was like, no, I didn't think I'd used the phone. And they were like, well, I'm just going to share something with you now then. At one point, one of your team picked up the phone to talk to the other room. You grabbed it out of their hand and slammed it back down in the receiver and went, no, don't do that. It'll give them an advantage. I completely misread the essay question. You know, I'd fallen into that trap straight away. And I was just like, oh, wow, I didn't even know I'd done that. Like, that's how bad it was. But for whatever reason, luckily, but whether it's because it did feel like a psychologically safe space, I immediately just went, oh, right, that's really useful information. And by the end of the second day, they said, actually, you've probably had the biggest transformation here, because you really took what we were saying, and now you've really stepped back and are encouraging other people to sort of there, rather than just come in and do that dominating sort of thing. So that was, you know, a really interesting thing for me. That's, you know, I remember it like it was yesterday. But going back to this point of how do we make, you know, particularly what happens initially, we don't throw people right into the worst of it straight away. You know, there's all the preparation that happens before the event, as Ian was talking about the groups, but we still do sort of like a gentle icebreaker with some sort of basic learnings. And if we're putting them into a really complex multi-hour challenge, the first parts of it, we learn from things like video games and stuff like that, where the first parts the onboarding, we don't sort of say up front, here's all the rules, and you now spend half an hour understanding how to play the game. We get them straight into the game, but the rules emerge as they're playing it. And it's nice, simple tasks. They're like, oh, right, I understand how to use the computer, or what I need to do if I've done A, then I do B afterwards. And it just becomes familiar. And then we let the floodgates open, and sort of like in chaos ensues, and they become overwhelmed, and all the reactive tendencies happen and stuff like that. And yeah, but initially we make it quite a safe space for them in that way, just so that it's not too threatening, particularly if it's like a complex game with lots of moving parts.
Basically, and that reminds me of a conversation I had with Colleen Panier, who is a video game designer. So we spoke about what we can learn in facilitation about video game design. And she basically mentioned that we make failure a very easy to fail and thereby to learn, that we only get to the next level once we have gained the capabilities that we need for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we all know, right? If we gave them just a really fun, easy experience or game, they probably wouldn't learn anything. We learn through failure. That's where I learned in my story about putting the phone down. I learned because I did something really badly wrong, and it's really resonated with me, to this day. So we do. It's like I said, it's an interesting lens. We go right. Okay, in an
Simon,
escape.
just 1 second. We just lost you.
Oh.
After it's a very specific lens.
Okay, it's saying my internet's unstable. Is it? Can you hear me or?
Yes, no, it's perfect.
Okay.
It's the second it's dropped twice. The second time.
Okay. All right. So I was saying that from a video game perspective, absolutely. That there's so much to learn from that, and there's also the making failure safe, and part of it, like normally in an escape room, for example, you want most people to succeed. You want them to do well. You want them to complete it, and sort of get out in time or whatever, complete the challenge in time. And it's been really fascinating doing something for learning and development first, because we don't necessarily want that. We do want to have failures. We do want to have hot spots. In some ways, the team are going to learn more, and that's why they're there. If they do fail, if things, if they do show up themselves, and we do get to experience the real problems they're actually dealing with in their real life. So that's why we kind of sometimes create not impossible challenges, but like deliberate rabbit holes. We'll give them this is a fascinating object or task here, and it's worth lots of points. And they'll go down into a rabbit hole and think, I must solve it, I must solve it, I must solve it. No, you don't need to. We kind of just put it there to see if that would happen. And would someone else in your team or the leader go, hey, look, you spent a long time on that. Let's come back and join the rest of the group now, and stuff like that. All sorts of things like that.
Beautiful. So what I hear is to have small traps so that that the progression of failure becomes bigger. So first they have only small failures, so they can laugh about it and it's safe. And then they realize, oh, we're laughing about it. We learn it's okay to fail and to make mistakes. And then when they progress, the failures and mistakes get bigger because it's also safer.
Yes, and it's difficult to judge because, like, humans are humans. They what will happen in one group won't happen in another. But we often see a lot of the same sort of things. Yeah, and we do deliberately, as you say, design these little traps for them to fall into. And some people never even notice they're there and bypass it, and others, the whole team falls into the trap, and that becomes the big thing we try and unpack. Go on, Ian. You were going to say something.
Well, it's just interesting, isn't it? Because just going back right to the beginning of our conversation when we talked about VUCA, volatility and uncertainty, is I think this also is reflected in the mindset that we see amongst senior leaders. Senior leaders want to be good, so being bad or wrong or getting things wrong is bad. But also they want things to be perfect ahead of time. They want to know ahead of time, what does my transformation plan look like for the next 12 months? And then they engineer these really complex siloed programs with 12 different initiatives that never speak to each other for a year. And then they get to the end of the year and say, well, why did the program didn't work? And it's because in today's environment, there's no way we can have certainty what we need to do in 12 months. We need to put our best guess out there. So put a program together, but within a month, bring that whole community back together and say, right, we know we're going to fail. We know this isn't going to work. How do we need to adapt it? And that willingness to fail quick, learn from it and adapt at the collective level, it is probably a real skill that most leaders don't put enough attention in because their mindset is all about being perfect.
Yeah, and I think the entire generation of current leaders, that's what they've been trained on. And I think
Exactly.
it's not only a personality. Well, I think there's a self-selection into certain positions or roles or professions where we are more prone or not to be open to failure. I think when you're in software engineering or programming, you are used to the fact that it's never done.
Yep.
That it's constant failure and updates and things don't work and a bug appears. But I think when you're coming from risk management, from accounting, from even from mechanical engineering, I would say. I don't know anything about that, but from my understanding, you really want it to be perfect because it needs to last for another 100 years.
Yeah. When it comes to things like nuclear defense systems or aircraft, we really want that rigor
Yeah, we
and
don't want to
in
fail forward.
place. But other things, we don't need to sort of have quite as much thing. And as you say, I mean, my IT career for decades is absolutely that. Like, you've never finished creating a product. It's always something new because new needs emerge from the users or something like that. Nothing ever lasts and stays the same in IT.
No. In your opinion, what makes a workshop fail?
Question. It's a really good question. So I'm going to say one, two, three things. So
I think you're not speaking into your microphone.
No,
oh, sorry. No, I was mumbling to myself because I was thinking. Sorry, probably not very good for a podcast.
Gordon will cut that out.
Thank you. So I would say three things. And the first, I think we've already alluded to, and that is people's mindset when they walk in. I'm assuming this is a complex problem that we're dealing with in this workshop. If it's simple, then maybe not. But if it's a complex problem that we're dealing with, everybody needs to be walking into that thinking and seeing that they are part of the problem as well as the solution. And very often people are not going into that mindset. Our default mindset in business is so combative that people are often going in with their defenses up, looking how to keep themselves safe and how they can make sure that it's the other people who get blamed because it's all their fault. So unless you can somehow shift that and disrupt that, I think that is one of the most common reasons I've seen things fail. The second is actually language. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is coding language and really paying attention to the patterns of language that clients use. So we talk very much about the head, the heart, and the hand. When people are talking in the head, it's all around meaning. How does it all fit together? What's the big picture here? What's the root cause? When it's heart, it's affect, it's emotion. How are you impacted? How are you feeling? How will our people be impacted? And when it's hand, it's about doing. What are we going to do? And then if you can imagine, there's a matrix of first person, second person, and third person. So first person is when I'm disclosing what's going on in me. Second person is when I'm talking about what's going on between us or within the group. And then third person is when I'm talking about what's going on in the organization as a whole and everything outside of this room. And we pay a lot of attention to that. And what we find is that most teams have dynamics where they're stuck in using very, very small part of that whole canvas. So typically, for example, we see most teams don't engage in the language of affect. They don't talk about emotion. I was working once with a team, a very, very, very senior exec. So I'm not going to say who they were, but a very well-known company, global company. And I was trying to facilitate a quite important conflict amongst 15 of them, and they weren't getting anywhere. And so I tried to jump in to say, hey, can we stop? And they pushed me out of the way. One of them literally physically pushed me out of the way so they could carry. No, we've got to keep going. And rather than stop and pause at what they were doing, they just dug in deeper and went harder and started getting more aggressive. So I tried a second time and got rebuffed, and I didn't. And they pushed me away again. And the third time, I had to jump in the middle of the room, scream, stop at them because they've been going for 45 minutes. And then this is an example. They just weren't using the affect. So I said, we're going to go around the group one by one. How are you feeling about the progress you're making right now? And what you got out was, we're getting nowhere. I'm really pissed off. This is useless. I'm so frustrated. I'm like, great. Can we now try something else? So I think shifting the patterns of language that teams use into these areas they don't deploy often is the big contributor to the solution. And then the third thing for me, unfortunately, it does come back to this, is it comes back to the leader. So for a team to workshop an issue, what you are trying to do is to get to a horizontalization of power in that room. And that really ultimately is one of the key roles of a facilitator. We may be a team who's in a workshop and you might be my boss, Miriam, but while you're here, you want to be down on the same level. So I can tell you all the things that I don't normally tell you. And believe me, there's a lot, because we interview teams before we speak to them. And it's always stuff the leader doesn't know. But if the leader has a strong ego, if they're unwilling to be self-reflective themselves, right? If they're unwilling to engage in this kind of courageous vulnerability that is needed to work in these teams, then the rest of the team is never going to go there as well. So that's why often, even succeeding in a workshop, there may be some work that needs to be done with the leader before you go in. So sorry, that was very long-winded, but yeah, those three things for me. So it's capacity for self-reflection, language and the patterns of language we use or don't use, and then the leader and their ability to horizontalize power.
Yeah, very important points. Thank you.
I think the only thing I'd piggyback on there, which we touched on a bit before, it's only working with Ian that I've realized like just how much of an art form this is this ability in a heated thing to be able to come in and give some radical candor and actually just step in and just not let it take over the whole thing and just say, hey, look, sorry, you were just being a bit too much. Or actually, I'd like to hear from Steve over here now and stuff like that. You haven't spoken and stuff like that. Being able to sort of actually in the moment do that in a way that isn't threatening to the group is a real skill of being able to do that. So being able to have that in the moment radical candor and just say, hey, can we talk about what's just happening in the room and then get back to the problem we were discussing? And not let it consume, and also not let someone feel, oh, I've just got shamed in front of the group. It's really hard to do, but when it works, it's amazingly powerful.
Yeah. And what I hear is the courage to lead by the facilitator. And I think that's something that we rarely talk about. Like Ian sharing that jumping in the middle, trying a third time and then screaming, or having this radical candor, as you just mentioned, Simon, is requires courage by the facilitator to actually step up and say, okay, I will take on the lead and point out what's not working here.
Yes, although I would personally, I think there's some caveats with that, or there's a health warning that goes with that. And I guess just talking from my own personal experience, I mean, if I like my career's gone in 3 different phases. The first, I was really new to facilitation, and honestly, I was incredibly successful in those first years because of my open curiosity, which, by the way, I think you role model so beautifully, Miriam. But I was really curious. I didn't think I knew everything. I was open to learning. So when I made an observation, it was without judgment and without attachment. In the second phase of my career, I became really unhappy. And actually, my ego started to grow. I thought, now I say I can be a good facilitator when I'm in the right state. In those days, I used to say I am a good facilitator. And I felt I knew what groups wanted. And so I would be confronting them, but I'd be confronting them from this place of ego, from this place of I know best. And in this last phase of my life, I mean, I should add that what's helped me in this last phase was some personal difficulties meant I started doing 10-day silent meditation retreats.
Vipassana.
I've done about 20 of them in the last 15 years. And they've changed my facilitation practice entirely. So now what happens with these moments of confrontation is I'm normally incredibly present with the group, and they're having a conversation, and I can actually feel the energy of the group reverberating inside my body. And I'm reverberating in parallel with them. And then all of a sudden, they may be having like this really friendly conversation, but the energy in my body is totally different to what's manifesting on the outside of the group. And I just keep paying attention to that energy, and it builds 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 and inside me. I do nothing. And then all of a sudden, it's like whoosh. It's like what happens is it's almost like my consciousness goes above my head and above the whole situation. So I'm looking down on it. And I can see myself speaking words, and but they're not coming from me. They're coming from the field. And very often what's happening, I'm watching this from very high up on the room going, you can't say something like that. I've had moments where I've said, this is a total failure of leadership in this room. And I thought, oh my God, that sounded, I would never have thought to have said that. I wouldn't have done it. And yet it's the perfect thing that the group needs at that time. And then almost invariably, someone come up to that evening and say, you know, what you said at that moment was the perfect thing to say at the perfect time. And 99% of the time, I can't remember what it is I've said. So it's almost like the words coming through me rather than me going, right, I need to get this group sorted and being very cognitive about it. It's almost I'm just being present. And stuff just seems to magically come. I think I'm probably sounding a bit hippie now, but there is
You
something.
do, and that's absolutely fine.
Sounds like a flow state. You're almost in there.
Yeah, and I think this is another level of presence to really feel the group. And I think I did 4 Vipassana meditations and just signed up for my 5th one, so I can relate. And to have this sensation, and also to learn to just wait and not to react immediately. But then, and I wonder whether the group then senses the sincerity in your reaction, because you're coming from a space of care, so it has resonated with you, and then you're coming from a space of care where you speak out what nobody else dares to. And I think groups somehow sense that, whether there's ego involved or not in what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. And now I'm even more curious how, and we mentioned that in the very beginning, the collaboration works between the two of you, because now I see how inherently different your approaches can be, at least from where you're coming from. So how do you combine that? And maybe more interesting, where does it become difficult?
Go on, you go first, Ian.
No, please, Simon. I'm talking like you go.
All right. Well, I think the moment so Ian and I and other sort of my business partner Rob all met through basically Burning Man. We wouldn't have met without the sort of Burning Man community, so we can talk about that for ages, but I'll avoid that. And early on, so although I technically met Ian some while ago at a Burning Man event, it was sort of Rob who really sort of reintroduced me to Ian and sort of said, right, okay, we should do something together in immersive development and stuff like that. And fairly early on in that, I think there was a certain amount of conflict between myself and Ian was probably kind of going like, who is this guy? So like, who does he think he is? And I was talking to Rob separately and sort of going like, oh, I'm really worried and stuff like that. And he's like, oh, I'm not sure, Ian's really understand that. And I said, look, I can't tell Ian about what's really going on, right? I mean, I'm feeling really sort of threatened. This all taps into like stuff to do with my father and, someone who, with the fact that I thought about and almost committed suicide when I was a teenager. And he was like, no, Simon, you need to tell Ian this. He's going to have, it's going to change everything. I was like, really? And it was such a huge thing for me to sort of be like that open and vulnerable, not feel judged about it and go, well, this can be part of a work conversation. We can talk about stuff from like that from my childhood. And, there's various times it's happened with me and Ian, and where there's been that sort of like, real authenticity and openness. And it's really made the other person go, oh, I didn't know. I didn't realize that was going on for you. Thank you for sharing that. Now we can approach things in a completely different way. And so we do really practice what we preach effectively from there. So, yeah.
And I think the thing, it's been an amazing journey, I've got to say. And it's a really great journey of how to get people whose personality styles are fundamentally diametrically opposed. Simon and I are so, you couldn't put us into, we're 2 totally opposing quadrants. And somehow by necessity, I mean, if you look at, I hope no one's quoting, but Simon's background is in, it's in sort of risk management, it's in detailed project management, it's in technical design and game design. And all of these things, you have to be incredibly detailed, incredibly rational and analytical and break things down into pieces. And I'm working in an environment where, well, what's going to happen at 2:30 this afternoon? I said, well, I've got a vague idea, but honestly, I've got no idea. Whatever emerges is what happens. So I'm not wanting to tie stuff down. I want to speak at a high level. I want to, sense the whole before I go into parts. So every time we were meeting for the first 6 months, it was for both of us like pulling teeth. And I think we both questioned about, can this actually work? Because these meetings are taking so long and we're going to a depth of detail. And Simon's going, but Ian's leaving so many risks. And as Simon said, what we've done is really practice what we've preached around this here and now learning, because here and now learning is not just about immersive development events. You're building a muscle there so you can actually do it back in the real workplace. I think one of the things that you asked me before was how has L&D got things wrong, or what was. I think one of the other things that L&D, I don't understand it, is why we want to isolate learning from real work on the business. It's like I go to work and I do my job, and then I go into a classroom and I learn. And for example, this relationship between Simon and I, we spent a lot of time processing what was going on between us at a relational level. We weren't talking about the business. And some people have said, why are you wasting your time doing that? Because we had to put a lot of hours into this. And it felt like pulling teeth. And it was really, really painful. But what's come out the other end is we have a fantastic working relationship now. And I really believe that because we are so different, it enables us to create creative magic together. I couldn't have done this with another mini me. Simon couldn't have done it with another person more like him. It required these differences, and that's really required work. And just, I mean, the other part of this as well through that journey was not only has it impacted our businesses, it's also impacted our personal lives. So through these conversations and through really saying, hang on, what happened then? And what's your interpretation? What's your interpretation? We've both actually been on journeys of our own mental health and our own mental development. So I'd always known there was something wrong with me, but it's only since these conversations that I've got a diagnosis of ADHD. Actually, and it's through the feedback and the learning that was provided by Simon and Rob that I've learned, and it's changed my whole personal life. And Simon, do you want to say a bit about your journey as well on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, we had a almost explosive incident one day because, not being really authentic and stuff like that. And it was only that afterwards I was like, wow, what happened? Are we going to be able to work together anymore? That I kind of went into this. It was about the time my father had just died. And it was me also starting to go, oh, I'd always had a strange relationship with him, and just kind of going like, oh, I think he might have been autistic. This would explain so many things, why he didn't get so, I was like, why don't you understand what's going on in the room here in this social situation? And at the same time, I was like, again, Rob was sort of kind of going, well, maybe there's something here for you, Simon, on this spectrum as well. And I started looking at that and going, oh, this would make a lot of sense. And then when I started talking to someone else who I work really closely with, who's both very strongly autistic and ADHD, and has researched it and knows all sorts of stuff about it, and I started going into things about my child, and they're like, yeah, textbook, yeah, classic case and stuff like that. And I was like, right, okay. And there's definitely, as people often say, that there's superpower elements to all these, there can be to these things, but a lot of it's just about understanding things in yourself about what works for you, but also, in other people who have neurodivergent things, and kind of going, right, oh, okay, you hate to do this, right? You hate doing this kind of thing. Right, okay, well, we'll just do it differently. Now I know we'll do something differently. So yeah, it's definitely been a game changer, because again, it's like, it's stuff, as Ian said, it's like, I tried to always go like, I knew there was something wrong with me, but like there was always something in the back of my head where I was like, I didn't fit in, or I didn't understand what was going on. And the learning journey is never complete, right? We always started learning. Every day is a school day, and we're still going to learn stuff about each other, I'm sure, going forward. But that's been a really significant thing, I think, yeah, for both of us.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, as you said, it's to show that you're walking the talk. And I think having succeeded in making your working relationship work, and that's my assumption, helps you to be authentic in showing difficult work relationships that they can also make it work. Because you've done it. And I think what is so beautiful in your story, that it all boils down to being open and vulnerable enough to help the other person become empathetic. Because until you shared that your brain might function differently and that you have different preferences, you've been just being difficult.
Yep.
It's so easy to just put everyone who doesn't behave as we want it, or we are used to it, or as it fits us, into the "you're being difficult" box. And then suddenly when we understand, oh, they're not doing this on purpose. And then suddenly we become this very generous people who are ready to accommodate everyone.
Exactly.
Because they're not doing this on purpose to harm us. And I think that's a muscle also to train, to stop seeing everyone as a potential threat or an enemy.
Yeah.
And to maybe, but it's, yeah, it's difficult. It requires continuous effort. And I recently, so my mental help is that I try to remember, also in my interaction with my partner, that there are people who have lots of appetite and others don't have as much appetite. And I would never argue with someone why they're still hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But if my partner needs more structure, a different form of conversation and communication, then it's not about me to argue that.
Yeah.
But I
That's
think we
exactly.
have so far failed to understand that there are basic human needs that are not physical needs.
I think you're absolutely right. And can I add something else on there? And I think this comes back to the tribalism that you see between functions in business. Is what we often find as well is that between functions there's often lack of understanding, because what happens is you get, for example, these are stereotypes, but there is a truth to it. You get more introverted people in a finance function. You'll have more extroverted people in a sales function, and this leads to what we call normative truth. So there's three different types of truth we talk about. One is objective truth, which is 2 + 2 = 4. Subjective truth is I believe this political belief, whatever is true. But a normative truth is where it's groupthink, and it's where the group convinces itself. It's a subjective group truth. So what you start to see is all the people in sales start to think of the people in finance generally as quite introverted and boring. They reinforce their own personality style and they become really judgmental. And what was really lovely about this experience between us was it was almost like we were meeting from two very different functions. But by taking time out of the work to explain what's going on in the relational process between us, I started to learn so much more about how people think and feel differently to me in a way that I don't think had been as grounded before. I think that these kind of experiences, they build that empathy by helping me understand and see and learn how people, and it's become a really fascinating journey just for that, just for that process of learning alone. But I think you're right, it's critical in creating empathy.
Yeah. And I think we're not taking enough time to actually realize that people don't see the world through our eyes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have 2 questions left on my I always ask, and we are almost running out of time. What remains your facilitation challenge? And this can be individually or as a team. That is so inherently different.
So you mean in terms of what is it that we're aspiring to do now, or my goal is our goals are now? Is that what you mean by challenge, or
your challenge? What is still difficult despite all these years? The juicy bits.
So I'll go first. So then I think I'll come to the actual sort of mechanistic challenges that I face at the moment. But I think, if I'm really being honest with you, Miriam, there's a bigger systemic question I relate, which is outside of facilitation. And it's really about the system that these companies fit in. And it's the system of corporate multinationals. And I love the work of what we do. And, I talk very much that my job is a connection catalyst. I help create connection. I help balance direction with connection at work, because I think we've forgotten about the importance about relational connection. But then sometimes when you look at many companies, the type of leaders who are getting to the top, they're not necessarily always the best of us. They're often the ones who go against that mindset. They are very rational. They don't really focus on emotions. Some of them can be quite uncaring about their people. And even if you've got a really good meaning leadership team at the top, there are questions for me that get raised about helping a company to market more, to consume more, when we've got a consumerist crisis going on. So it's probably not as helpful for your webcast, but if I'm really honest, I think as a facilitator, one of the struggles I have now is about working with big corporates. And our passion now is to work more with medium, fast growing companies or big corporates that really want to do something different. So I think there's a question there about just the societal context we're living in, and whether really global corporations really are that more helpful to us anymore. But that's probably outside of the facilitation space. I think for me within facilitation, my biggest challenge at the moment, let's not talk about offsites and immersive events, but just in terms of meetings with clients, is the pressure on time that everyone is exerting. And you particularly see this in technology companies. And I understand why it happens, but I feel it's gone too far, which is that every meeting is a half-hour meeting. And people's diaries is just like bing, 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 full of meetings. Now, I fully accept that it needs to be like that for 90% of the time. But there are some problems that are so complex and so big that you can't have a half-hour meeting to solve it. You need to slow down. You need to take 3 hours, bring people together, really spend some time listening to everyone's perception of the problem before you go deep. Oh, look at that slow productivity. She's holding up the book. That's exactly my point. So it's getting people to slow down. It really is a real challenge in today's always on, a million miles an hour, faster is better kind of culture.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the other side of that, as I said, in corporate IT and particularly sort of agile tech companies, and it's, the pace can be just relentless. There is it is just, I remember there's been weeks where it's been like, I've got my weeks filled with meetings. When am I going to get any work done? That's my job isn't just to attend meetings, but there's so many of them there. And am I really critical to all of them? And the shame of like, oh, I just don't show up to a meeting. What are they going to think? And stuff like that. It's a real insidious pressure to just conform and go, well, I've been invited to a meeting, I must go to it. And I feel bad that I've been invited to 3 meetings in the same hour and I've got to pick, and it's just like, why should that be my problem to deal with? It's something far more systemic. So yeah, it is. Ian's right. It's a big challenge, and I find it's very useful for me when I'm designing things to try and help people in those situations that I've been on the other side of the fence. And sometimes I can just talk to them in the breaks and stuff and go, I really understand what you're going through because I've been through it myself.
Yeah. And I was just showing the book Slow Productivity that I've been just fascinated by. And I was actually reflecting, what if we applied slow productivity on our work as workshop designers or meeting designers, doing less at a more natural pace, higher quality. And then coming back to what you shared earlier and taking the time for these real human conversations to understand how do we actually relate and communicate to each other. And if we're not slowing down to have these conversations, then every of these half-hour meetings that you just referred to will become a progression of the pressure cooker. And just, increasing the potential conflict because of misunderstanding, misalignment.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates really, really strongly. I guess what I wanted to do is probably wrong to open this up on the end of a webcast, but I don't think the challenge is as easy as we just need to do something differently. I think there is actually, I hesitate to say this, but I will say this provocatively. I think there's a sickness in the human condition. And I think the sickness is thought, it's thinking. Thinking is hugely beneficial to us, and it's given all the technology that we want. But if you imagine 50 to 100,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first emerged, and we had our first thought and we first learned language, that thought we would have had one thought an hour, like run, hide, have sex. But the rest of the time, that voice was silent, and we were in a flow state in our embodied awareness, not in our thoughts, happy and therefore in flow. So we didn't need to look for cigarettes, we didn't need to look for drugs, we didn't need to look for sex to get into this flow state because we were in flow. But we're only having like 1 or 2 thoughts an hour. Since that time, 50,000 years ago, I bet if you could measure how many thoughts on average go through a person's head, it's just going up perpendicularly like this, and it's going up exponentially. And I think there are 2 points about that, is that if we want to slow down, you can only access that flow state when you're not thinking. So if we really want to get to a more productive, a slower, a higher quality, a more connected culture, I think there's a bigger question around how do we legitimize and create an environment where people can learn to switch off thought, where they don't have to be on all days, and where actually just sitting and being present is a really is valued just as much as thinking. So I think there's a biological question or a psychological question for us in there as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I recently had Mark Walsh on the podcast, who is the embodiment, I would call him the embodiment guru. I don't know whether he would support that. But it's exactly that. So when did we lose the connection to our body? And that's what you described earlier in the room, where you sense that something is to happen. But in order to sense that, we need to listen to our body. And with all the thoughts, we lost it. And that was my realization. My last Vipassana was just before the pandemic. And I'm now realizing I was an edge away from a burnout, and realize, okay, I need to go back to retrain this muscle, because it's crazy what's going on in my brain and on my agenda.
Yeah. I mean, I saw it in some of our experiences where we often step in and intervene. You know, we might be running a game for like multiple hours, and increasingly we're like, oh, there's real value of just stepping in the game and going, right, press pause on the game and the clock. And we get people to talk about what was going on there. One of the first things, you know, I saw Ian do was like just kind of go, right, ring a bell or something and go, right, we're all just going to meditate for a minute. And I was like, what is this weird woo-woo stuff you're bringing into this game and stuff like that? And then you start to realize the power of it. It's like, right, just spend a minute just listening to your body. What's going on for you? Just pause. You know, you were in such a, you know, it was a high pressured game. The clock's kicking down. There's always components moving around and stuff like that. Just pause. Listen to what's going on for you, because you're not doing that. And it's really important to the success of what you're trying to do. And then after a minute of just everyone just right, not speaking and thinking, just standing in a circle, right, let's quickly go around the room one at a time, just a couple of words. What are you feeling? What are you feeling? And just get a sense of what's happening in the room. And now, right, let's talk. Now we've got that. Let's talk about what do we do about it, and how do we apply that to when we throw you back into the experience. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, the power
Taking
to
that pause.
snap an entire group out.
Yeah, yeah, because they're not used to it.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Final question. What is it that you would have wished you had known before when you just got started?
Oh, wow. Do you want to go first, Dan?
No, please, Simon.
I was saying that because I was like, what do I wish I'd known before I started? I think it's, you know, just having been through a corporate career of multiple decades, it's just that these things are possible, you know, because I had so little exposure to pausing, authentic conversations, you know, not just let's do the work and be as efficient and process driven as possible. In an IT career, there's just so much of that. And just to even understand that, like, not only is it possible, it's desirable. You know, there, if I was going to go back into an IT career, and I'm not, then I would want to bring all that in and go, guys, no, let's create like an afternoon where we don't just, you know, just go off and spend some time thinking about things and create the space for it. Or let's make it safe in a retrospective, in that retrospective, to sort of go, right, okay, all right, that's what's going wrong in the program and the build and stuff like that. But what's going wrong in the team?
Mm.
And for everyone to feel safe about that. It's to be able to sort of bring that in, and that we can create these immersive dominant experiences that are psychologically safe to, you know, help make people realize that and take that back into their work and go, oh, we don't just have to do it in the game. We could do that in work as well. It worked there, so surely it will work in work as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I think for me, if there's one thing I wish I'd known when I was younger, and I think this is a function of my age and wisdom, he said, hopefully, it's just that the world is, there's a saying, a really favorite saying of mine by a quantum physicist, David Bohm, and he had this weird quote that I never really understood when I first read it. And he says, thought creates the world and then says I didn't do it. And I love that quote. Thought creates the world and says I didn't do it. And I never understood it when I was young. I was a typical cognitive. I was so into theories. I mean, the latest theory, give it to me. And all my presentations and my workshops were full of theories. And because I thought that was where the world was. I thought I was my thoughts. I thought I was thinking things. There's a whole world underneath that. There's a whole world beneath thinking, beneath the cognitive, beneath the verbal. And when we slow down, when we pause our thinking to really focus on that, it unfolds into, well, it can take you on a journey to a most wonderful place and create so much more happiness in your life. So I think if I'd have known that earlier, I probably would have embarked on this path much sooner and potentially been a bit further along by now, but no regrets at all.
Thank you so much, Simon and Ian. It's been a delight.
Same.
Thank you. It's
to
been
be in
really great fun.
conversation with you. Yeah.
Lovely
It's
to
been a
meet
lot
you,
of fun.
Lynn. Yeah.
Thank you. And if the audience wants to find you, connect you, we'll put the links in the show notes.
Great.
If there's
Fantastic.
one way where you would like to send them, where would that be?
Oh, just the websites, I think.
Yeah, I think just put our 2 website addresses up. That would be great.
Perfect. I would do that.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.